In February 2001, federal agents executed a coordinated arrest at a warehouse in southeast Houston. The target was a Mexican national who had spent 6 years managing logistics for one of the largest drug trafficking organizations operating across the U.S.-Mexico border. He controlled transport routes through Texas, Arizona, and California. He managed cash drops totaling hundreds of millions of dollars. He maintained safe houses in 12 American cities. The arrest was the culmination of a 4-year investigation involving the Drug Enforcement Administration, U.S. Customs, and the FBI. Agents seized financial ledgers, encrypted communications equipment, and $500,000 in cash. The evidence was overwhelming. The case was airtight. The suspect was booked, arraigned, and held without bail. Then he disappeared. Within 3 months, court dates were canceled. The docket went dark. The federal case collapsed without explanation. The suspect was released from custody and transferred to an undisclosed location. He was not a fugitive. He was not exonerated. He was something else entirely. He was a protected intelligence asset of the Central Intelligence Agency. This is the story of how one designation reversed years of law enforcement work, halted a federal prosecution, and revealed a system where strategic value can override criminal accountability. The conflict between intelligence gathering and criminal prosecution did not begin in Houston. It was embedded in the institutional architecture of American foreign policy. After the Cold War ended, the CIA's mission in Latin America shifted. Soviet influence had collapsed. Communist insurgencies were waning, but new priorities emerged: political stability, counter-narcotics, and the containment of transnational organized crime. These objectives created contradictions. The most valuable intelligence sources in Latin America were often the same individuals involved in the drug trade. Cartel leaders had access to political networks, military contacts, and financial systems that no legitimate source could provide. They knew which governors were corrupt, which generals were compromised, which bankers were laundering money for which factions. The CIA needed this information. The DEA needed these same individuals in prison. By the mid-1990s, the agency had developed formal recruitment programs targeting figures within organized crime structures. The programs were classified under various code names and operated through CIA stations in Mexico City, Bogota, Guatemala City, and Tegucigalpa. The criteria for recruitment were specific. Potential assets were evaluated based on their access to political intelligence, their willingness to cooperate, and their ability to provide verifiable information. Criminal history was noted, but not disqualifying. In many cases, it was the reason for recruitment. A trafficker who had bribed a state governor possessed intelligence value. A logistics coordinator who knew which military units were protecting shipments possessed intelligence value. A money launderer who understood the banking relationships of political elites possessed intelligence value. The fact that these individuals were simultaneously engaged in narcotics trafficking was treated as a secondary consideration. The legal framework for these arrangements was established through classified memoranda between the CIA and the Department of Justice. Under these agreements, the agency could designate foreign nationals as intelligence assets and request that criminal proceedings be suspended or modified in the interest of national security. The authority was broad. The oversight was minimal. DEA field agents working in Latin America encountered the consequences of this system repeatedly. Investigations would progress for months or years, building evidence against significant trafficking figures. Then, without warning, the cases would stall, targets would become unavailable, cooperating witnesses would be relocated, prosecution would be declined. The pattern was consistent enough that agents developed informal terminology for it. They called it the wall, the point at which an investigation ran into classification barriers that could not be crossed. What they were encountering was not bureaucratic dysfunction, it was policy. The intelligence community had determined that certain individuals provided strategic value that outweighed the law enforcement benefit of their prosecution. This calculation was made at levels above the field agents who built the cases. It was made above the prosecutors who prepared the indictments. It was made in classified spaces where national security priorities were weighed against criminal justice outcomes. The man arrested in Houston in 2001 was one of these calculations. His name has never been publicly released. In court documents, he is referred to only as Subject X. In intelligence files, he carried a different designation, one that would prove more powerful than any criminal charge. The investigation that led to Subject X's arrest began in 1997. DEA agents in El Paso had identified a sophisticated logistics network moving cocaine from Mexico into the United States through multiple entry points. The network used commercial trucking companies, private aircraft, and maritime vessels. It maintained warehouses in Texas, Arizona, and California. It laundered proceeds through real estate investments, car dealerships, and cash-intensive retail businesses. The organization was methodical. Shipments were compartmentalized. Communications were encrypted. Personnel were rotated regularly to prevent pattern recognition by surveillance teams. Over 4 years, investigators mapped the network structure through wiretaps, informant testimony, and financial analysis. They identified 17 individuals involved in U.S. operations. They traced the money flows. They documented the command structure. Subject X sat near the top of that structure. He was not the organization's leader. That individual remained in Mexico beyond the reach of U.S. law enforcement. But Subject X was the primary coordinator for American operations. He managed relationships with domestic distributors. He oversaw transportation logistics. He controlled the cash consolidation process that moved drug proceeds back across the border. The evidence against him was extensive. Wiretap recordings captured his voice, giving instructions to subordinates. Financial records showed his signature on property deeds used to launder money. Informants described his role in operational planning meetings. When agents arrested him at the Houston warehouse on February 14, 2001, they believed they had secured one of the most significant trafficking prosecutions in years. The initial proceedings went smoothly. Subject X was arraigned in federal court. He was denied bail based on flight risk and the severity of the charges. A trial date was set for September. Then, in late March, the lead prosecutor received an unusual communication. The message came through classified channels from the CIA's Counterintelligence Center. It stated that Subject X was a registered foreign intelligence asset and that his prosecution would compromise ongoing national security operations. The communication requested an immediate meeting to discuss resolution options. The prosecutor contacted his supervisors at the Department of Justice. Within days, a sealed legal motion was filed in federal court. The motion cited national security interests under the Classified Information Procedures Act and requested that proceedings be suspended. The judge granted the motion. DEA agents who had spent 4 years building the case were not consulted. They were informed after the fact that Subject X would be transferred from federal custody to an undisclosed location and that the prosecution would not proceed. Internal communications from that period, later obtained through congressional investigation, documented the agency's reaction. One email from a senior DEA official to the Houston field office stated, "This is not the first time and won't be the last. Document everything and move on." Subject X was released from federal detention on April 23, 2001. His whereabouts for the following decade remained classified. The case against him was never formally dismissed. It simply stopped. The docket shows no activity after the sealed motion. The other 16 defendants in the network were prosecuted. Subject X was not. The relationship between Subject X and the Central Intelligence Agency began 2 years before his arrest. In 1999, a CIA case officer stationed at the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City initiated contact with Subject X through an intermediary. The case officer, whose identity remains classified, was part of a program targeting individuals with access to Mexican political and military intelligence. Subject X fit the profile precisely. His logistics role within the trafficking organization required him to maintain relationships with corrupt officials at multiple levels of Mexican government. He paid bribes to customs inspectors, police commanders, and military officers. He knew which politicians received cartel funding. He understood the internal rivalries between competing factions. This information had value beyond drug enforcement. The late 1990s were a period of political transition in Mexico. The 70-year dominance of the Institutional Revolutionary Party was ending. New political forces were emerging. The United States needed intelligence on how these changes would affect bilateral relations, security cooperation, and economic policy. Subject X could provide that intelligence. The recruitment process followed standard protocols. Initial meetings were conducted in neutral locations, hotels in Monterrey and Guadalajara. Subject X was assessed for reliability, access, and motivation. His information was tested against other sources to verify accuracy. By early 2000, he had been formally designated as a foreign intelligence asset. The terms of his cooperation were documented in a classified agreement. In exchange for regular intelligence reports, Subject X would receive financial compensation, legal protection in matters related to his cooperation, and relocation assistance if his status was compromised. The agreement did not explicitly authorize his continued involvement in drug trafficking, but it did not prohibit it either. The CIA's interest was in the intelligence he provided, not the activities that gave him access to that intelligence. Over the following 18 months, Subject X delivered substantial value. He provided documentation of payments made by trafficking organizations to officials within Mexico's military procurement system. He identified which state governors were receiving cartel funding and in what amounts. He revealed the structure of protection arrangements between regional military commanders and trafficking operations. This information was compiled into intelligence reports that were shared with the State Department, the National Security Council, and select congressional committees. The reports contributed to U.S. assessments of Mexican political stability and informed diplomatic communications between the two governments. The CIA considered Subject X one of its most productive assets in Mexico. When DEA agents arrested him in Houston, the agency faced a choice. It could allow the prosecution to proceed, losing a valuable intelligence source and potentially compromising related operations, or it could invoke its authority to protect him. The decision was made at senior levels within the Directorate of Operations. Subject X's intelligence value was deemed to outweigh the law enforcement benefit of his prosecution. A formal request was transmitted to the Department of Justice to suspend proceedings. The request was granted. In the classified assessment that accompanied the request, the case officer who had recruited Subject X wrote, "Asset has provided actionable intelligence on Mexican political military corruption that cannot be replicated through other sources. Loss of asset would significantly degrade collection capabilities in priority target areas." The assessment did not mention the cocaine shipments. It did not mention the money laundering. It did not mention the 4 years of investigation that would be nullified. Those considerations were outside the scope of the evaluation. What follows is reconstructed from court records, FOIA responses, and interviews with former federal prosecutors conducted between 2015 and 2021. In the months following Subject X's release, the Houston case file underwent a systematic process of classification and redaction. The original indictment, which named Subject X alongside 16 co-defendants, was amended. His name was removed. References to his role in the organization were excised. The evidence that had been compiled against him, wiretaps, financial records, informant statements, was transferred to classified storage. To anyone reviewing the public record, it appeared as though Subject X had never been part of the case. The other defendants were prosecuted successfully. 14 pleaded guilty. 2 went to trial and were convicted. Sentences ranged from 8 to 25 years. The organization's U.S. operations were disrupted, but the man who had coordinated those operations remained free. Journalists who covered the original arrest noticed the discrepancy. Court records showed Subject X's arraignment and bail hearing. Then nothing. No trial, no plea, No dismissal. The case simply ended. Reporters filed Freedom of Information Act requests seeking explanation. Every request was denied. The responses cited national security exemptions under FOIA and stated that no additional information could be provided. In 2005, a legal advocacy organization filed a lawsuit seeking disclosure of the sealed court motions. The case was dismissed on standing grounds. The judge noted that without knowing the contents of the sealed materials, the plaintiffs could not demonstrate specific harm. The wall held. The first crack appeared in 2010. A former DEA agent who had worked on the Houston investigation provided documents to a congressional oversight committee. The documents included internal communications expressing frustration with the CIA's intervention and a summary of the evidence that had been compiled against Subject X. The agent testified in closed session before the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. His testimony described the process by which the case had been terminated and raised concerns about the lack of interagency coordination. The committee requested a formal review from the Inspectors General of both the CIA and the Department of Justice. The review took 3 years. In 2013, the Joint Inspector General report was completed. It was classified in its entirety. A summary was provided to congressional leadership. The summary concluded that the actions taken in the Subject X matter were within the boundaries of existing legal policy and interagency agreements. It noted that the CIA had followed established procedures for requesting prosecution suspension. It acknowledged that DEA had not been consulted prior to the decision, but stated that consultation was not required under existing protocols. The summary recommended no disciplinary action. It suggested no policy changes. It treated the outcome as the system functioning as designed. For the agents who had built the case, the conclusion was bitter. One former investigator, speaking on condition of anonymity, described the experience. "We spent 4 years on that case. We had everything. And then we were told it didn't matter because someone in Virginia decided he was more useful free than in prison." The investigator paused. "The drugs didn't stop. The network didn't stop. We just moved on to the next case and pretended this one never happened." Subject X was never seen again in any U.S. court proceeding. His current status, whether he remains under CIA protection, whether he has returned to Mexico, whether he is alive, is unknown. The file remains classified. In 2008, a Mexican attorney named Rafael Mendoza contacted the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara with an unusual request. Mendoza represented a client who claimed to have information about American intelligence operations in Mexico. The client was willing to provide testimony in exchange for protection and legal immunity. He said he had worked with the CIA for nearly a decade and that he possessed documentation of activities that would be of significant interest to U.S. law enforcement. The consulate forwarded the request to the FBI's legal attaché office in Mexico City. An initial meeting was arranged. The client was Subject X. He had spent 7 years outside the United States following his release from federal custody. According to his account, the CIA had relocated him to Central America initially, then to Spain, and finally back to Mexico under a new identity. He had continued providing intelligence intermittently, but had become increasingly concerned about his long-term security. His handlers, he claimed, had become unresponsive. Payments had stopped. He believed he was being phased out of the program without the protections he had been promised. He wanted to negotiate a new arrangement, this time with law enforcement rather than intelligence. The FBI agents who met with Subject X found his account credible but incomplete. He provided details about his original recruitment and cooperation that matched information from other sources. He described meetings with CIA officers, dead drops, and communication protocols. He offered to provide documentation he had retained. But he was also evasive about his continued involvement in trafficking activities. When asked directly whether he had maintained connections to cartel operations after 2001, he declined to answer. The FBI agents reported the contact to headquarters. The case was assigned to a counterintelligence unit for evaluation. Within weeks, the evaluation was terminated. A directive from the Deputy Attorney General's office instructed the FBI to cease contact with Subject X and to transfer all materials related to the interaction to CIA custody. The directive cited ongoing intelligence equities and stated that any further engagement would require authorization from the Director of National Intelligence. That authorization was never requested. Subject X's attorney made several additional attempts to establish communication with U.S. authorities. Each was rebuffed. In 2009, Mendoza filed a formal complaint with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, alleging that his client had been denied due process protections. The complaint was never adjudicated. In March 2010, Rafael Mendoza was shot dead outside his office in Guadalajara. The murder was attributed to organized crime. No arrests were made. Subject X was never heard from again. Whether he is alive or dead, whether he returned to cartel operations or remained in hiding, whether he retained the documentation he claimed to possess, none of this is known. His file remains the property of the Central Intelligence Agency. His case remains an example of how intelligence priorities can subsume every other consideration. The agents who tried to prosecute him have retired or moved to other assignments. The prosecutors who prepared his indictment have gone into private practice. The case officer who recruited him remains unidentified. Only the precedent endures. The Subject X case was not unique. It was representative. Between 1995 and 2015, the CIA invoked national security authorities to intervene in federal criminal proceedings on at least 47 documented occasions. The targets of intervention included drug traffickers, arms dealers, money launderers, and individuals suspected of involvement in terrorism financing. In each case, the pattern was similar. Law enforcement agencies built cases through traditional investigative methods. Indictments were prepared, arrests were made, and then, at varying stages of the process, the CIA asserted that the defendant possessed intelligence value that outweighed the benefit of prosecution. The legal mechanism for these interventions evolved over time. Initially, the agency relied on informal communications between the Director of Central Intelligence and the Attorney General. By the early 2000s, the process had been formalized through classified memoranda that established criteria for intervention and procedures for resolving interagency disputes. These memoranda gave the CIA substantial authority. Once an individual was designated as a foreign intelligence asset, the agency could request suspension of criminal proceedings, modification of charges, or transfer of custody. The Department of Justice was required to consider these requests in light of national security interests. In practice, the requests were rarely denied. A 2012 study by the Congressional Research Service examined 23 cases where CIA intervention had been documented through declassified materials or congressional testimony. In 21 of those cases, the agency's request was granted in full. In the remaining 2, partial accommodations were made. The study noted that no formal appeals process existed for challenging an asset designation. Once the CIA determined that an individual possessed intelligence value, the determination was effectively final. Law enforcement agencies could express disagreement through internal channels, but they had no authority to override the decision. Former federal prosecutors interviewed for this account described the dynamic in consistent terms. They understood that certain cases would be blocked. They understood that certain individuals were protected. They understood that the reasons would never be explained. One former assistant U.S. attorney who served in the Southern District of Texas between 2003 and 2011 summarized the experience. You learn to recognize the signs. A case starts going sideways, communications get delayed, witnesses become unavailable. Eventually, someone tells you to stand down, and you do. The prosecutor paused. You don't ask questions because you know you won't get answers. You just move on to the next case. This accommodation became institutionalized. By 2010, DEA field offices had developed informal protocols for identifying cases that might trigger CIA intervention. Investigations targeting individuals with political connections in foreign governments were flagged for early review. Cases involving assets in sensitive regions, Mexico, Central America, Afghanistan, Pakistan, were handled with additional caution. The goal was not to avoid these investigations, but to manage expectation. Agents understood that their work might be nullified at any point by forces beyond their control. They built cases knowing that success was not guaranteed even when the evidence was overwhelming. The system created perverse incentives. Individuals with access to political intelligence could engage in criminal activity with reduced risk of prosecution. The more valuable their information, the more protection they received. The more protection they received, the more freedom they had to continue their criminal enterprises. Some assets reportedly exploited this dynamic deliberately. They provided just enough intelligence to maintain their protected status while continuing to profit from drug trafficking, money laundering, and other illegal activities. The CIA defended its approach as a necessary trade-off in a complex world. Agency officials, speaking on background to congressional committees, argued that the intelligence provided by these assets contributed to national security in ways that could not be measured against individual prosecutions. They pointed to disrupted terrorist plots, exposed corruption networks, and diplomatic successes that had been enabled by information from protected sources. The argument was not unreasonable. It was also impossible to verify. The benefits of intelligence cooperation were classified. The costs of foregone prosecutions were visible only to the agents who had built the cases. The public saw neither. The calculation remained hidden. As of 2025, Subject X has never been publicly identified. His name does not appear in any court record, any declassified document, or any journalistic account. He exists only as a designation, a case study in how American institutions prioritize competing interests when those interests cannot be reconciled. The investigation that targeted him consumed 4 years and significant resources. The evidence compiled against him was sufficient for conviction. The prosecutors who prepared his case believed they had built an airtight prosecution. None of it mattered. In the calculation that determined his fate, intelligence value outweighed criminal accountability. The information he provided about Mexican political corruption was deemed more important than the cocaine he had helped transport to American cities. The relationships he maintained with foreign officials were deemed more valuable than the justice his victims might have received. This calculation was not made by rogue actors or corrupt officials. It was made by senior leadership at the Central Intelligence Agency and approved by the Department of Justice. It followed established procedures. It complied with existing legal authorities. It was, by every institutional measure, proper. That is what makes the case significant. Subject X was not an anomaly. He was a product of a system designed to make exactly this kind of trade-off. A system where national security interests can override law enforcement priorities, where intelligence value can exempt individuals from prosecution, where strategic calculations can nullify years of investigative work. The system remains in place. No legislation has been passed to limit the CIA's authority to intervene in criminal proceedings. No oversight mechanism has been created to review asset designations. No appeals process has been established for law enforcement agencies seeking to challenge intelligence claims. The trade-offs continue to be made in classified spaces by officials whose names will never be known, using criteria that will never be disclosed. Subject X's network was never fully dismantled. The trafficking routes he managed were eventually taken over by competitors. The cocaine continued flowing. The money continued laundering. The violence continued spreading. His cooperation contributed to diplomatic cables and intelligence assessments. It informed policy discussions and bilateral negotiations. It provided value that was real, if impossible to quantify. But the drugs he helped transport destroyed lives. The money he laundered corrupted institutions. The impunity he enjoyed sent a message to others in his position. Cooperation with American intelligence offers protection that no criminal defense can match. In a system that prioritizes information over conviction, accountability becomes optional. Subject X understood this. So did the people who protected him.